Be live in the Element Wealth Studios, Dave Hughes on a Friday morning, and we're joined now over a very long connection, might I add, by Philip Mantle, author and publisher of the book Beyond Reasonable Doubt, which does a really good job of chronicling the story of the Pascagoula alien abduction from almost 50 years ago. We're not quite to the anniversary yet, but we're very close. And Philip, number one, welcome to the show. Great to talk to you. How are you? You're in England, right?
Yeah, good morning, Gerard. I'm fine, thank you.
Now, let me ask you this. We're very close, and I know you have said this before. You were hoping, and I think we were all hoping, that Calvin Parker would make it to the 50th anniversary, and we just lost him. So that's got to be a blow because you two were friends, right?
Yes, I mean, Calvin was one of the two gentlemen involved back in 1973, the other being Charles Hickson. And Charlie died in 2011. And Calvin had been fighting kidney cancer for some time. But we did hope that come this October the 11th, the 50th anniversary, he'd still be with us. But sadly, he passed away on August the 24th. But, Calvin and I became great friends over the years. We knew the news was coming, but it was still sad to hear it when it arrived, all the same. And he was a real gentleman and a scholar, and he will be sadly missed by all who knew him.
Kind of an off-the-wall question that I want to ask is, back when this event happened, one of their immediate concerns was the possibility of some type of radiation they had been exposed to or something else, and they actually went and got checked out at Keesler Air Force Base. Was there any concern or any thought in Calvin's mind at any point that you know of that maybe what happened to him led to the cancer that ultimately took his life?
He certainly toyed with that idea, yes, but Calvin had been, ill prior to this as well with totally different ailments. He'd had a minor stroke at one point, and he also had, open heart surgery. So, this was the next thing that came along, I'm afraid. But he did toy with the idea, yes, but, how seriously he took it, I'm not so sure.
Now, let me ask you this. The book, does a great job of starting from the very beginning of this entire experience. But one thing I want to make sure that we stress here, you give in the book the testimony, for lack of a better term, from both Calvin and Charles, their sides of the story. It's kind of hard to really understand just how huge of a thing this was when it happened back in 1973. We've kind of gotten used to hearing about UFO reports and everything else. This was an enormous breaking piece of news when it happened and started to get out, wasn't it?
Absolutely. I mean, journalists descended upon the small town of Pascagoula, Mississippi, in one way or another. And I remember the Sheriff Fred Diamond, remarking that they'd literally had thousands of telephone calls, thousands, mostly from journalists. And of course, Calvin was, haunted by journalists for the rest of his life. He didn't really want to say anything. He wanted to just live a normal life. Whereas Mr. Hickson, he was happy to talk to them. And it did make headlines around the world. And, in my archive here at home, I have hundreds and hundreds of newspaper cuttings in many different languages. It also made its way into popular culture. For example, the Fleetwood Mac in 1976 recorded a song called Hypnotized, and it is partially based on Charlie and Calvin's story. Italian TV station RAI made a 2-part TV movie about it. Charlie and Calvin had no idea, that this had been done. So it spread in many, many different ways.
Well, and the thing is, let's go back to something you said just a second ago. Charles was very happy to talk about this with anybody that wanted to talk to him about it. Calvin, not so much, and that was from the very beginning. He didn't want to tell anybody after it happened at all, and just kind of pretend it didn't happen. Is that right?
That's right. I mean, from the minute that it happened, and they were stood alone on the pier, shivering and shaking. Calvin says, "We're not going to tell anyone." And one of the reasons, and it may seem strange to us today in modern time, but Calvin had recently got engaged, and he was frightened that if this story got out, his fiance's father wouldn't let them marry. And it's a reasonable thing. So they set off to drive home, Charlie and Calvin. Calvin was driving on the intent of going home and telling no one. But it was Charlie who had a change of heart en route. And he said, "Look, Calvin, what if these things come back and do this to somebody else?" Charlie had also been in the US Army and had fought in Korea. So he then said, "What if it's an invasion?" So they pulled in at a convenience store, a little shop, and used the public telephone. And the first place they phoned was Keesler Air Force Base. And they said, "Sorry, guys, we're not in the UFO business anymore. Ring the local authorities," which they did. And they ended up at Jackson County Sheriff's Department being interviewed by Fred Diamond and his deputies. They were even recorded secretly talking. They thought, "Well, catch them now." They'll be laughing and joking. But on this secret tape, it was quite the opposite. Calvin's crawling up the walls and Charlie's trying to reassure his young friend. So from day one, Calvin didn't want anything to do with it. But Charlie, being older and having more experience, certainly in his military days, he took it on board and was the torchbearer for it.
Now, we just have a couple of minutes before the break, so I'm going to give you probably the tallest order you have been given so far. For those people that, and I don't know why you wouldn't be at this point, but for those people who aren't familiar with the story we're talking about with Charlie and Calvin, can you sum it up in like a minute and a half? What happened to them? What they say occurred
Absolutely.
that night in Pascagoula?
Yeah. They'd been working in the shipyard that day, and both guys liked fishing. So Charlie says, "We'll do a spot of fishing tonight." Yep. Picked up the gear, bought some bait, and they're on an old pier, an abandoned shipyard on the Pascagoula River, right by Highway 90, with the bridge going over the river. And this blue light came from behind them. Calvin thought it was the police. But when they turned round, it wasn't. It was this rugby ball-shaped object descending. It stopped a couple of feet above the ground. An opening appeared. 3 strange creatures came out. 2 got hold of Charlie, 1 of Calvin, took them on board this thing, did some kind of examination, and deposited them back on the pier. That's it in a nutshell. And both men, were totally scared to death.
As you would be in that situation. And I think what made this story stand out above so many of the other claims and stories that you hear is the fact that, their testimony never wavered. What they said happened was always consistent. Eventually, they were given a lie detector test, passed it with flying colors. They were put under hypnosis and literally couldn't stay under hypnosis for very long because they were freaking out, reliving it, and they couldn't calm them down, right?
Absolutely. And they were literally at the Jackson County Sheriff's Office within hours of this happening, which is unprecedented. There are other incidents like this at different times, but there was no, and of course you mentioned Keesler Air Force Base. In our book, we have a transcript of the whole conversation at Keesler because they had a stenographer who recorded it all. There's nothing redacted. There's all the Air Force personnel all named. I think that transcript is about 17 pages long, and it gives a detailed account of what happened to them that night.
And I think that's another thing that lends to the credibility of this story in a lot of people's eyes is the amount of detail. And again, the fact that those details in all of this time never changed. Those men's stories never changed one iota. Which really kind of solidifies it as something that, yes, this is something that has to be taken seriously.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, we spoke to the police dispatcher who was on duty that night. He took the call from Charles Hickson. And he said, "Philip," he said, "I took over 50 calls of people reporting UFOs on the telephone." And then he said, "When I went back to the police station, there were people there in person reporting it as well." And that was all entered in the police log. So the police knew from the very beginning almost that Charlie and Calvin weren't alone in this. There were others that was, reporting these things that night. And of course, in our research for the new book, we uncovered many of those that did indeed see something that night, not just Charlie and Calvin.
Philip Mantle, author and publisher of the book Beyond Reasonable Doubt about the Pascagoula alien abduction that happened back in 1973. Can you hang on through the break for just a few more minutes?
Of course.
Fantastic. We'll continue talking to Philip right after this in the Element Well Studios on Middays, SuperTalk, Mississippi. Mississippi Middays, live in the Element Well Studios. Dave Hughes in on this Friday. Philip Mantle joining us from England, the author and publisher of the book Beyond Reasonable Doubt. And that's a great title for the book because a lot of experts basically use that phrase to describe this case and what Calvin and Charlie said happened to them in 1973 in Pascagoula, right?
Absolutely. I mean, my co-author of the book is Dr. Irina Scott in Ohio, a retired academic. And we had a working title for the book. It just didn't fit. And I was watching a courtroom drama TV show one night, and they said, we have to prove this beyond reasonable doubt. And I emailed Irina and I said, I think I have a title for the book. Because we're confident that all the information and all the new evidence we've obtained, that's all published in the book, that if we were able to take that to a courtroom, Dave, we could prove beyond reasonable doubt that something extraordinary took place that night. We'd never be able to prove they were abducted by aliens, but something totally bizarre. And I think the title, fits the evidence.
Well, and that's why I think there is still a lot of interest in this case and whatever it was that happened in Pascagoula on that night, because between their testimony of what happened to them personally and all of the other people that reported seeing something strange that night, that's an awful lot of evidence to just spontaneously pile up in one place. It's too much smoke for there not to be some type of fire behind it, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I mentioned the motorway bridge or the bridge that goes over the river. I mean, we had a gentleman by the name of Charles Anderson said, I was driving over that bridge that night with my wife and I saw the thing. It was down below me. He said, I thought it was going to crash. We had a gentleman by the name of Mr. Lewis Lee, who was working in the shipyard that night on the other side of the river. He was a crane driver. And he says, Philip, he said, my cab is about 10 feet off the ground. And he says, as soon as I looked out over the river, I could see this darn thing. Never seen anything like it in my life. And I asked Mr. Lee, I said, did you report it to anyone? He said, well, I told my wife and family. He said, but Philip, this is 1973. There's no Ghostbusters to call, So he didn't hide it, but there was no way to officially report it. And they're just a couple of examples, Dave, of the many people that we've interviewed.
Well, and the thing is, yes, it was that way in 1973. We're finally starting to get rid of some of the stigma and make it more normalized to be able to report this kind of thing without getting repercussions from friends and family and workers and employers and everybody else. Because for the longest time, if you saw something, well, you kind of kept it to yourself because, well, you were going to get those looks and it was going to cause you problems in life.
Absolutely. And in 2018, Calvin finally, told his story in full. And he did local television, national, and even international television. And it was amazing to see the difference between now and 1973. He was treated with respect. People asked polite questions. They didn't laugh at him. We recently came across some old letters that belonged to Mr. Hickson. And one of those letters is from a lady, and she's writing to apologize on behalf of the TV companies in America, because she'd watched them on the TV and they were laughed at, So there was a huge difference, these 50 years later. And of course, what it did, Dave, it encouraged other people to now step out from behind, closed doors. They'd seen what happened in 1973 and thought, they're not going to make a fool of me. But second time around, when Calvin steps forward and he's treated with respect, it encouraged other people to say, well, maybe it's time we told someone. And thankfully, a lot of them told myself and my colleague, Dr. Irina Scott.
Well, the book, Beyond Reasonable Doubt, is it out yet?
It is. It's available now. It's in 3 languages. It's in English, Spanish, and French. It's in a variety of different formats as well. So there's hardback, paperback, there's a Kindle, there's even an audiobook version. So hopefully there's something there for everyone.
Now, how do people get their hands on it? If they want a copy of this book, and if they're paying attention, they want a copy of this book, how do they get that? Yeah, it's a little plug for you. Philip, how do they get their hands on it?
Thank you. And it's simple. Just go to Amazon and punch it in, and there you go. And you'll find all 3 languages on Amazon, no problem. And you can order it pretty much anywhere around the world, and you'll get a copy.
Beyond Reasonable Doubt is the name of the book. Philip Mantle, one of the authors, your co-author's name again?
Dr. Irina Scott.
Dr. Irina Scott, but just search for Beyond Reasonable Doubt, Philip Mantle. Trust me, it's going to come up on Amazon, and you're going to be really glad that you did that search. Read it, because this is a fascinating piece of Mississippi history that is becoming more important as this subject becomes a lot more acceptable and a lot more the focus of attention, both legislatively and in the public as well. Philip, I have enjoyed it so much. Keep us up to date, and thank you for writing this book.
No, thank you. Thank you very much for allowing me to speak to your listeners and your viewers. Thank you very much indeed.
Great talking to you. Hopefully we'll talk to you again soon. We have hour number 2 of Middays in the Element Wealth Studios after news.